Alright everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video I just want to kind of share my thoughts on recovery from OCD and mainly my journey so far, what's been happening. I will be using graphs in this video. Unfortunately, there's no mathematical solution to recover from OCD. This is just gonna be me talking about my subjective experience. So let's grab the first graph. There we go. So we have mental health mapped onto time. So as time passes, what's been happening to my mental health. So you see the line is not a straight line. It's always going up and down a little bit because of course there's no linear progression or regression. But you can see here the trend downwards. It looks like it's going down very fast, but this is actually a long time that's shown here in the graph. So let's say when I was younger, I already had certain tendencies, but let's just say I was doing fine. And my mental health was slowly getting worse and worse and worse. But I wasn't really aware of that. I didn't really know any better. But actually, looking back, I was doing a bunch of compulsions that I didn't recognize as those. And I was making my mental health worse. So it's only you see here at the very bottom that I noticed, wow, there's a big problem here. I remember experiencing an intrusive thought that I was in shock that I could experience such a thought, and it really made me spiral. And that's when I noticed, okay, there's a problem here. Kind of luckily for me at the time, at least, I decided to look it up on Google, something about like unwanted thoughts, and then I found some information on that, and that kind of gave me some reassurance that okay, this thought is unwanted. It doesn't have to represent me, and I was able to kind of let this thought go that I had been like obsessing over for some days. In my head, I was okay again at that point, but of course, my mental health didn't just improve drastically all of a sudden. I just learned that one thing that actually just gave me reassurance about this thought. And as you probably know, reassurance is not the greatest thing when you're struggling with OCD or in general as a human being, because if we're starting to crave reassurance and we get it, the brain just demands more and more and more. So that's, you see the trend upwards a little bit. I got that hit of reassurance, but very soon after it started to go down again because I didn't really learn any useful skills about cutting out compulsions or improving my mental health. So we're going to the next graph. So as you can see, the mental health is pretty low. And this was around the time, so we've skipped some time, and now I first started getting help from a psychologist here in the Netherlands. And as you can see, there's a little trend upwards that displays kind of the fact that, okay, there's somebody that's helping me now, and that also gave me just a little bit of relief and might have just improved my mental state a little bit because there was somebody to rely on or fall back on. But as you can see, after that, nothing much changed because I wasn't really able to make any useful changes in therapy. And then there's a very steep line upwards. And what I'm displaying there is the fact that I remember from time to time, there were times where I'm like, oh, I actually feel fine now. And I still noticed I didn't really make any big change or cut out any big compulsions, but there was just times where the anxiety wasn't as bad. I started feeling a bit more chill. I just remember that happening, and I've heard other people share about this as well. So that's kind of what I'm displaying here. So the mental health seems to be a bit better, and then it drops off again. Once again, wasn't really able to make any lasting changes. So the next graph is also, it's still not looking great. That psychologist ended up referring me to a more specialized team, specialized on OCD and ERP therapy, exposure and response prevention. So that's what I did for a while. And as you can see, it was up and down, but the therapy, I didn't get a lot out of it. I was doing a bunch of exposures but I wasn't really doing the response prevention part. So cutting out the compulsions, I was still doing those. I wasn't really able to cut any of them out. So then, of course, you can do a lot of exposures, but that just won't magically change stuff. I had to make changes, and I wasn't really able to when I was working with the team on ERP. So that's what this graph kind of shows, just up and down, but generally quite low still. So then I decided to take a different route, and I started working with Mark Freeman. Many of you will probably be on my channel through Mark, but if you don't know Mark, check him out. The link is in the description. He has a great channel on mental health in general, but he also has experience with the OCD diagnosis. And he's a mental health coach, and he has recovered from OCD and a bunch of other diagnoses himself as well. I started working with Mark. Still, it took some time for me to get going. So I started working on some exercises with Mark, but I remember I wasn't really able to make any big changes yet. And we also spoke about this. It was like gently untying a knot, and the knot was tied up like it was a very strong knot. So it took some time to get things moving. So that's what you see here. Not any real big changes. I remember also like another real low at the time as well. So that's what's displayed here. And then I started building back up again a little bit. So that's like the first period with Mark. And then at some point I started to actually make some lasting changes, do some actions consistently that were very useful to me. I also started engaging more with the community, a community Mark has set up, and that was also beneficial for me. So I made some great changes. As you can see, the mental health got to a pretty decent point. We'll talk later about actually like where on the graph is the recovery line. But yeah, as you can see, pretty good. But then, oof, I fell back again. You can call it a relapse. And yeah, that has been happening a couple of times. So that's what's been shown here at the end. Though what I want to mention here is that, as you can see, the relapse was not all the way to the bottom. So because of the skills I learned, it was a little bit easier to build back up again, and I didn't hit like rock bottom as I would in the past. But still, there was some pretty nasty relapses, and that's kind of where we're at now. So right now, I'm decent. I'm not working with Mark anymore. I learned a bunch from him, and I kind of know what I want to change. So now it's just about making the changes, because I feel like personally for me, I want to get to a better point than just decent, because it's easy to fall back again from decent if something challenging happens. It doesn't have to be a perfect process. I've made useful changes and I'm in a way better place than I was, let's say, 5 years ago, like drastically better, and that's already great. So let's talk a bit more about recovery. When are you recovered? When am I recovered? Have I been recovered? Am I in recovery now? Let's talk a bit more about that. In front of me, I have the so-called Y box, and that stands for Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. And I remember I had to fill some of these out when I was in therapy, so I thought I'd revisit them again to start us off talking about recovery. There's 10 questions, and you score each question from 0 to 4, and 4 is like the most severe or the most extreme. I got a score of 10, and that lands me in the category mild. So I have right now a mild form of OCD. If you score 0 to 7, you get the score subclinical. Let's talk a bit more about this questionnaire and then how I am approaching recovery right now. So the questionnaire is basically split into two parts. So as we all know, OCD stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. And in this questionnaire, the first part focuses on the obsessions and the second part on the compulsions. So let's start with the obsessions. You can kind of view these as the so-called symptoms. And of course, when we're tracking recovery from an illness, it would make a lot of sense to track absence of symptoms or severity of symptoms. However, focusing really hard on getting rid of your obsessions might actually be detrimental. And here's where we might approach mental illness quite differently from physical illness. Because you've probably tried doing that already. You've probably worked super hard, done a bunch of rituals to get rid of the obsessions, and yet they're still here or they are even increasing. And that's where we get to the second part of the questionnaire about the compulsions, because the compulsions are usually about trying to get rid of the obsessions. You could describe compulsions as the way we react to uncertainty, anxiety, and other feelings we don't like. Cutting out compulsions is super useful for our mental health. And cutting out compulsions is usually about acceptance. It's about not trying to fix thoughts and feelings we struggle with. Then there's a second thing that I find super useful with approaching recovery from OCD, and those are values. So we've decided we're not going to spend our time on compulsions anymore. We're going to work on cutting those out, but it's going to be very useful to identify what we do want to spend our times on. And that also really helps with acceptance, because if we really want to accept obsessions, it really shouldn't matter whether they are there or not. We're still going to be doing our valued actions. So this all ties together very nicely. Values are like directions. They help us decide what we want to spend our time and energy on. When we're very deep in the compulsion hole, we're very far away from the person we want to be and the things we want to be doing. We think we want the compulsions, but actually they are making us miserable and they are digging a huge hole. So recovery and reclaiming your life is about getting out of that hole. And values are super useful for that. To get an idea of what values to explore, which direction to explore, you might ask yourself, if all of my fears were completely 100% solved, what would I be spending my time and energy on? And even if you're blanking to this question, that's totally fine and happens a lot. We can just start exploring. We don't have to get this right. We might borrow some values from others, see what worked for others, and start that way. So, the way I approach recovery from OCD is as follows. I cut out compulsions and accept any thought or feeling while spending time on the things I value. Basically, there's actions I don't do and actions I do. This might not be the fanciest answer, but it's kind of up to you. Personally, I don't feel that I am fully recovered yet. But that might also be because I set the bar quite high for myself. If we look at my definition of recovery, then in my life there's definitely still some compulsions I want to cut out, and I stray away from my values a little more than I'd like. But I'm doing well. Others might see me as recovered. As you saw earlier, I score quite low on the Y box and I've already made big changes in my life. I think it's really important though that we don't get stuck on the concept of recovery. I view it not as much as a place to get to, but more as a continuous practice. Like I said, there's actions I want to do, there's actions I want to cut out, and I can practice that every day. So each day I try to be intentional with how I spend my time and energy. If I keep doing that, then maybe someday I'll just realize, hey, I think I'm recovered.